It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Professor Vijay Kumar is the Nemirovsky Family Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. And those of you who know him know that he has had every possible leadership position in the School of Engineering and many positions in the government as well. We're extremely grateful to you, Vijay, for taking time off of your monstrous schedule to come and participate and speak to us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. A big thanks to you and Mike for organizing this event. And of course, I welcome the opportunity to participate, not because I'm an expert in the field, but I do want to take this opportunity to share some of my concerns with autonomy, with robotics as it pertains to military systems. And even more so as an educator and as dean of an engineering school. So I have a few slides. I'm mostly going to ramble on my own experience and my thoughts. And it's mostly so I can get some feedback from all of you who are attending this workshop. So first, I want to just talk about robotics. And of course, you might argue that autonomy doesn't really need an embodiment. It only needs computing and perhaps a connection through the internet to be effective. But I want to talk about embodied autonomy. So in its broadest sense, I think of robotics as the integration of 4 technologies. And I list these 4 technologies because in each of these dimensions, robots are already superhuman. So computing, this is an obvious one. Robots can out-calculate or out-compute humans with 10 to the 14 neurons. There's simply no comparison. Communication, I think of robots as having infinite bandwidth, capable of reaching any other robot anywhere, any human being. So clearly outperforming humans in that sense. Cameras being able to see the world at a macroscopic view or a microscopic view, again, anywhere in the world, and any phenomenon of interest. And then finally, perhaps the thing that's of most relevance is this idea of control, which is taking actions autonomously and quickly. And of course, military robotics is a direct interplay of the technology, but also the interplay with science fiction and military funding. If you think about advances in robotics, almost all of these advances inspire science fiction, and that feeds, again, advances in robotics. And both these feed into military applications. So you go back to Star Wars, you think about the all-terrain armored transport vehicle or Terminator. They were all creations in science fiction, but based on scientific research. And Peter Singer talks in his book about how people who develop new technologies consciously draw on science fiction and use that to pitch these ideas to the Pentagon. And he even interviews and introduces many science fiction authors who consult for the military. And the same thing is true for academics. So he describes the growth of unmanned systems on the ground. In 5 years, the number of unmanned systems deployed grew from 0 to 12,000 during the Gulf War. And of course, planes that can be flown from an office 10,000 miles away. And so none of this is really new to us, but what was new when I read this book was trying to get a sense of how decisions get made in the Pentagon and how they embrace technologies that we develop. So I'd love to think that it's because of some really smart academics that decisions are made, but actually science fiction has a lot to do with it. And of course, I want to go back to my very first encounter with science fiction and Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, which to me are very seductive. Asimov's laws are most profound. A robot may not injure a human being, must obey a human being, must protect itself. These are great laws. But there are so many situations in which these laws fail. And in fact, if you look at any one of his short stories, they're all about how these laws fail. But more importantly, from our perspective, these laws really don't tell us how to write robot programs or even define a concept of operations that's consistent with these laws. And sure, if you look in the robotics community, there are people who say, we want to develop safe robots, compliant robots, human-friendly robots. And those are noble goals. But at the end of the day, we really cannot implement the spirit in which these laws were intended. And I think Asimov himself realized this. He formulated a zeroth law, which was more fundamental. A robot may not harm humanity, or by inaction allow humanity to come from harm. So I think this is a great law. And of course, these laws have spurred so much discussion in robot ethics. One in particular, I thought was quite interesting. For example, Sage has this information theoretic concept of empowerment as a heuristic to guide concepts like self-preservation, protection of other human beings, and response to human actions. And there's a very readable account of this in Scientific American, for those of you who are not interested in the technical aspects. So as I think back to all of this, you suddenly realize, well, this is not a new challenge, right? So if you look at the very first robot, and again, my colleagues might disagree with me on this, but the very first robot, I think, was demonstrated by Tesla in this 1898 exhibition, where he had an indoor pool, a 4-foot-long miniature ship, which I have this black and white picture of. There's a control box with lots of antennae, and he was able to transmit radio signals from a remote control box to the ship, and the ships had lights, and he actually pitched it to the military as a way of guiding boats, presumably that could be weaponized. So that was the first point where I think robots were pitched to the military. And then I describe here a couple of inflection points. I think the Hezbollah, although we had UAVs for a while, the fact that essentially a terrorist organization, at least viewed by the West as a terrorist organization, made an incursion in Israeli airspace. This shook people. 2004, I think, clearly with evil intentions, and people started looking at this very closely. And then, of course, the deployment during the Obama administration of weaponized drones in Afghanistan, 2012 to 2014, that was another inflection point. And after that point, there was no turning back. So today we talk about autonomous weaponized drones. And in reality, those drones are very much human controlled. So this is an office from which in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where there are 2 operators that are essentially controlling everything that this predator does. And this prompted General Norton Schwartz on NPR to come out and say, and he bristled at the characterization of these vehicles as drones. And he says, drones mischaracterize what these things are. They're not dumb, nor are they unmanned, actually. And of course, the Air Force calls them remotely piloted vehicles. So maybe they're not autonomous. They're remotely piloted weapons. And Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work, who was a guest of Perry Wohlhaus, famously said the wars are fought by humans and not technologies. And Claire, of course, referred to the U.S. military doctrine, DoD 3000.09, that also embodies all of this. But the reality is, when you fight wars remotely, you remove operators from the battlefield, and the human decisions that are made, they may be made by the human, but they're made by automated systems. So for example, going back to the Predator, you look at a lot of the target recognition that happens. Much of it is informed today by computer vision systems that are trained by statistical machine learning algorithms. And so again, maybe the human decisions are in fact, made by humans, but they're based oftentimes on systems that are automated. So the question of, what decision made by the human, what's made by the machine is somewhat blurred. I think to me, the big difference is that the op tempo, as the military calls it, is just much faster. And Mike's article talks about this quite a bit. The advantage of speed, of course, he was talking about the impact on deterrence and stability, as did Claire do. But the big reason why the military does want to invest in this is because of the fact that the op tempo can be driven up. And when the op tempo is driven up, humans do not make good decisions. So at the end of the day, you've got a conflict. You've got things that are becoming faster and faster because of automation, if you will. At the same time, you want humans to fight the wars, and there's a fundamental mismatch, I think, in these remotely piloted weapons. I think to me, the biggest conflict is that human operators who are operating these vehicles remotely do not compete. So they lack feedback, once again, leading to perhaps poor judgment. But even the bigger problem is that you, at the end of the day, you don't assess the damage you made. There's this quote by a general that you have operators that are flying this predator. They wreak havoc. They cause mayhem. They come back home. They have a steak dinner. All is forgotten. And somehow it dehumanizes war in the way that is really worrisome. And so at the end of the day, the question is, are remote operators like this held accountable? So yes, you may argue that they're making decisions and therefore they're held accountable, but at the same time, they're making decisions based on incomplete information. The weapon systems are informed by supporting systems that might not themselves be very effective. So we can talk about remotely piloted weapons or talk about lethal autonomous weapon systems. And here I picked a definition from the Future of Life Institute, but the distinction between these two in my mind are blurred. By the way, the Future of Life Institute, for those of you who might not know, includes many luminaries. Max Tegmark is the president. Max was a physicist who started his career at Penn, but it includes many luminaries, including Elon Musk and formerly Stephen Hawking, and also Stuart Russell, who's a expert in AI who is widely respected. The Future of Life Institute has pushed for legally binding treaties banning lethal AWS. But of course, this is very unlikely to happen for the reasons we've discussed thus far. It is, in fact, a deterrent. Why would any country give up the ability to develop laws? So the thing that really has brought things to me in sharp focus is this idea of weaponized swarms. I don't know how many of you have been following the recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. This is the first time we saw the use of multiple drones. There were surveillance drones, there were decoy drones, and finally weaponized drones. And I think this is the first war that was won exclusively by drones. And it saw the use of swarms of drones in conflict. And unfortunately, drones and swarms is what my group works on. And so this has now brought it home to me in a very, very real way. And that's why I was so enthusiastic about this workshop, the fact that Dan and Mike decided to organize this. And I've started asking myself this question as to what are our challenges as technologies, what are our responsibilities? And I just want to throw out 4 challenges. And let me start with the first one. First, in this field, we have an accountability crisis. And this is something that Christopher Mims wrote about in 2018. Yes, it was 3 years ago. And if you look at this picture, the 3 superheroes, 2 of them, Elizabeth Holmes and Travis Kalanick, are no longer superheroes. But the point he was making is that we're living in this era of inflated expectations set by technologists that we want to succeed. Society wants them to succeed. And whether we talk about unrealistic expectations for urban transit or self-driving cars or AI, there are a lot of very prominent, smart people that are driving up the hype. And I think our first responsibility is really to be able to call out intellectual dishonesty, particularly in the field of AI. And again, formally, if you ask a scientist to apply standards of rational evaluation, you'll say, of course, that makes sense, but this is not being done in a standard way, and not enough of us who call this out. So if you look at AI, I show this video mostly to show the limitations of what robots cannot do. Robots are nowhere close to doing what this 2-year-old, what this 3-year-old is doing, almost absent-mindedly picking up blocks using amazing hand-eye coordination to build the structure. The fact is, AI has had almost no impact in autonomy in driving, autonomy in drones, in industrial robots. It has had a lot of impact in computer vision, in object recognition, classification, speech recognition, and so on. But even at the highest end, AI systems are prone to failures, and it's very easy to expose brittle cases where these AI systems fail. So that brings me to my second challenge, which is to focus on AI research. And this is taken almost directly from a paper that Stuart Russell wrote. So what is our responsibility? We want to focus on, I would say, four very, very simple things, right? Simple things in the sense it's easy to explain, but really hard to solve. This is verification, validity, security, and control. So verification has to do, and I'll take the example of a washing machine. So suppose I build a washing machine. I must be able to prove that the washing machine satisfies certain properties. Does it wash dishes? Does it wash clothes? And did I build the system right? This is an easy question to answer. How can you show that it's valid? Well, you want to show that it meets the formal requirements. In other words, does it wash clothes? Or does it chase my pet around the room and wash my cat instead? So the answer to did I build the right system is an easy yes or no. Security is another one. If you're building a system, it has to be secure. How can you guarantee that? And then finally, control. And this is where lethal autonomous systems, the discussion is now a lot more tricky. How do you enable meaningful control over an AI system after it starts to operate? And I think a lot of research is needed in this area. And so as academics, as technologists, this is something we need to focus on. The third thing I would focus on is asking ourselves this question, and I admit I don't have the answer to this, but what's our moral and ethical obligation as researchers? So this is a 2013 picture shortly after Nova received released its Rise of the Drones episode, where our group was fortunate enough to be featured. And I'm sitting at that time, Abe Karam, who's the inventor of the Predator, widely regarded as the father of drones. And on my right is General Deptula, the guy who actually, excuse me, deployed all the drones in Afghanistan. And we had a great conversation. This was a panel. And to the extreme left is Peter Singer, who was bringing up these very, very uncomfortable questions of where is this going and where is humanity headed? So I come back to campus, and later that summer, there were demonstrations right outside our lab about stopping US drones. So this is across the street on 34th and Walnut, end the drone war. And it didn't take long for people to make the direct connection between the research that was going on in our lab and something that was widely believed to be unacceptable. So what was our moral obligation in this setting? Well, what's our role here? Well, we develop new technologies. And I show here technologies that's not simply that was developed in the lab, but now is being transitioned to companies. So here's Exxon Technologies, a startup that started in my lab, but now it's quite amazing the progress that's being made. Here you could see a vehicle that's completely free of GPS, completely free of human control, being able to go into a building and create amazing three-dimensional maps. And if I let this video play out, it also is able, you'll see it has the ability to detect human beings. I think you'll see this in a minute. So not only can it detect these pillars, these roofs, but it can also find human beings. And of course, Exxon is using it for mining and manufacturing, operating many thousand feet below the ground, where clearly all of Asimov's rules are being adhered to in the strictest sense. But here you can see this technology coming out of a lab now, having the kind of precision, the reliability that industry is now able to use it and do lots of useful things with it. This is what we do as researchers. The other thing we do is we lower the barrier to entry. I want to show you examples of drones that are powered by roughly the same kind of processors that you see in your smartphones and cameras that all of you carry on your smartphones. Only thing novel here is the algorithmic side of things, the software, and the lead author here, Aaron Weinstein, is 6 months out of school after getting a degree at Penn and is able to create these robot swarms using only cameras and the hardware that you get in a smartphone, and of course 4 propellers and a battery, are able to operate indoors or outdoors without GPS. And you can just imagine where this technology can go. And so the question I ask is, what's our obligation as an educator? And then most recently, I received an email that I thought I would share with you, and I've blacked out some of the words here because it refers to one of my students. But if you look at the bottom left, I should say one of our students. If you look at the bottom left, this is about Turkey and its collaboration with Azerbaijan. And the question that this person is asking me is whether it's our fault or are we responsible in some sense to anticipate these kinds of events, and how do we train our students? So to me, this is a real question. And as an educator, I worry about this. As a technologist in this field, I ask, what's our responsibility and how do we ensure that the good of the technology outweighs the bad? Even more broadly, there are some of my colleagues who ask, should we accept DoD funding for any of our work? And the thing I worry a lot about is how do we develop technologies that essentially counter the asymmetry. If your technology is easy to use, well, you run into the problem that the bad actors might use this technology, and how do you counter that? I want to finish with one last slide, which has to do with responsible innovation. This is a picture of the Sydney Harbor Bridge. And I'm reminded of this as engineers, we're always trained to think in terms of factors of safety because the implication of this bridge coming down is just enormous. And so there's a little pin that holds this bridge, and the factor of safety that's used in designing that pin is 4, because that pin is critical for the bridge's safety. So what is the analog in AI? And I'm pleased to see that there's a lot of interest in what are the 4 key ideals here: fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. Also pleased that ACM and societies like this are taking this fairly seriously. I know Dan Kotichek is going to talk a lot more about IEEE Code of Conduct and ethics, but to me, the key phrase here, the key attribute here is accountability. How can we help hold people accountable? So going back to the remotely operated vehicles, I think if a human being were to be held accountable for bad decisions, I think there's a difference with which he or she might approach the challenge. And likewise, when an engineer develops something, the question is, how do we think about accountability in terms of that particular innovation? More broadly, I think we want to define what responsible innovation means as a school. And I think it's important for us to convey all of this as we teach our students. Dan, thank you very much once again for inviting me. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to take questions.
We really have time for questions, and the floor is open. I see a question from Drew again. Go ahead, Drew.
Hey, Vijay. Thanks for the talk. I'm currently working with Davide Scaramuzza here at ETH Zurich on limit handling of drone systems. So I think, again, your talk is really highly relevant. I'm curious about, touching more on this ethical responsibility component. Sometimes I wonder whether or not this technology development, when it comes to weaponized autonomous systems, is inevitable. And by de facto taking the stance of we're not going to develop this technology for ethical reasons actually puts us at a higher risk from the point of humanity. Sometimes I feel like I almost have to be at the front of the ship, steering the technological development, knowing that likely it has immense lethal capacity for the sake of keeping it out of the hands of somebody else that maybe has more malicious intent. Curious what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I completely agree with you. This is why I think the Future of Life Institute's goal to ban these weapons or to impose moral standards, I think is in fact, Isaac Asimov himself, there are some skeptics who say he formulated these laws because all his stories about how those laws don't work. So it's unclear that you can actually do this and uphold standards in a way that makes sense. But I think for us to ignore that and not to, as educators, not to bring those debates to the classroom, if you will, I think is a mistake. It's a missed opportunity. And I think we should, as we think about technology, we should go in with our eyes wide open, because surely, as you believe, the good outweighs the bad.
Okay, folks, of course, we're having many questions. I see Claire had her hand up, and then Susan. I think that's what we'll have time for until the panel at 4. Go ahead, Claire.
Well, Vijay, I just want to say how glad I am to hear you grappling with these ethical issues and calling for educators to bring debate about ethical aspects of technology into the classroom. I wanted very quickly just to state my own view, which is echoes the last question, which is, you really don't do any good by refusing to develop the technologies. That is part of pushing back on the forefronts of knowledge. It's the duty of universities and of those who have the capacity to do so, to do that. However, I think it does impose additional ethical duties on those who develop those technologies to engage with the ethical issues and the legal issues. And as the technologies become increasingly lethal and our ability to deploy them greater and greater, those duties should also increase. And so the question is how to meet those duties. But I, again, just so glad you are thinking in this way and asking us all to engage in these questions.
Okay, a quick response so that we get Susan in as well.
I just want to thank Claire for her comment. I've been a big admirer of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law that she directs.
And that you're still on.
I'm a member, and Claire has not thrown me out because of my inactivity or a lack of participation. But I do think that it is, just coming back to an earlier comment, it is the role of universities not only to push technology, but also to have these uncomfortable discussions. And it's our duty also to bring some of these discussions to our students. I see Britt Shields, one of my colleagues in the audience, who is actually developing courses that actually focus on these issues. So Claire, we're going to need your help as we go forward with this.
Susan, let's ask you to close out our session with your question to Vijay.
No, Vijay, that was so interesting, and I agree with Claire. It's wonderful to hear you so deeply and intelligently engaged with this. I have a question that reveals my own ignorance. I own a car that has certain technologies that prevent me from doing some things with my car. Is there any exploration in terms of drones or remote technologies or autonomous robots to build in for a technological fix, to build in it, make it technically impossible to turn something into a weapon or whatever? And this must be happening, and you must know about it. So I'm just raising it as a question.
I think every drone company is interested in imposing restrictions on how the drone is being used. I know there's an active debate at Exxon, the company I'm most familiar with, on how they can impose restrictions on how their products can be used. I know companies like DJI have technological blocks, if you will, similar to DRMs on where the drones can fly. But I'll tell you, part of the challenge we have is we lower the barrier to entry for technologists. And the first thing you do when you get a system that's proprietary is you try to figure out how everybody can use it without going through the EULA agreements and then being forced to use the software the way the company intended you to. That's in our DNA as engineers. So unfortunately, not only do we advocate for these restrictions, but we also point you to ways to break those restrictions. And I think that's the tension we have. But as Claire was alluding to, every DARPA program manager lives with this. The motto is, do not be surprised. And so if you're going to build something, that if someone's going to build something with negative consequences, wouldn't you rather the good guys develop it first? And so there's a little bit of that that drives engineering, particularly at universities. And I don't have an easy answer to your solution, but there are very, very smart people that are thinking about this.
Again, it's my very, very sad duty to stop the discussion in midstream. We'll be coming back to this at the end of the day for sure in the panel discussion. I also note that Professor Jessa Lingle, who's speaking in the afternoon, has spent a lot of her time thinking about users' use and misuse and alternating uses of technologies. And so this theme will certainly be recurring throughout the day. Thank you very much, Vijay. Meanwhile, it's my great pleasure and privilege again to introduce our next speaker, who, once again, I was only introduced to Jonathan through Mike Horowitz in the context of this meeting. I've already learned a lot from him. Professor Jonathan Moreno is the David and Lynn Silfen University professor. He's got appointments in many departments, including the medical school and the history of sociology of science. PhD professor, long distinguished career in many aspects of ethics and medical ethics. And we're very fortunate that, Jonathan, that you could take the time to join us. Thank you very, very much. And I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. And thanks to engineering and Searle and everybody else who helped to make this possible, Perry. So I didn't listen to much of the morning because I was afraid that if I listened to the other speakers, I would be distracted and want to respond to the other speakers. And I have a really insanely tight 57 slide PowerPoint that I won't get through as it is. So I'm going to jump in, but I do want to pick up on the point that Drew raised a couple of minutes ago. So I'm going to, with any luck, start my slide share. So hoping you can see this slide. If anybody wants to nod, Daniel, good? Great. So I've done so many classes already and talks and I'm still kind of not, it's a sign of age, not totally sure of myself, but good. Thank you for the thumbs up. So where to start? A few weeks ago, and I don't know if anybody else has mentioned this yet, General Milley made this remark about geopolitical change. And I thought, well, that's the motivation for this symposium. Technological innovation in robotics, hypersonic weapons, AI, and other technologies. That's the day, right? This is what we're talking about with lethal autonomous weapon systems being, really part of the tip of the spear, whatever cliche you want to come up with. And so couldn't be more timely. I had a really hard time putting this slide deck together. And so I decided to do what I tell my students to do when they're not sure that the audience is going to get it after they go through this very disparate set of topics. I made my own cheat sheet. So basically, here's the argument. Over the last couple of decades, and not sort of in this order, but overlapping, I'll talk about sort of the ethics of autonomous robotic systems, how I got into this, the excitement about autonomous weapon systems expressed through remarks that were made by defense planners over the years, particularly, I would say, within the last 10 years. Then there's a sort of trying to figure out what autonomy means when we're talking it this way. And Dan and I had a brief exchange about this, pulling back, I think, on the enthusiasm about the notion of autonomy, a notion, or not a concept, I think, but a notion. And I think very recently a shift to teaming or collaboration kind of talk. And at the end, if I have a moment, I'll tell you about a project that I've just started with Minerva Research Initiative funding that Mike Horowitz also is an alumnus of the Minerva program that goes to this issue of teaming or collaboration and ethics. But here's a cross-cutting problem. Cross-cutting problem is, as we know, that whatever the heck AI is inextricably linked to the problem of what the heck autonomy is. And we don't know what AI means either. In fact, in 2019, the DoD published a report in which it was looking at all the AI programs over DoD, and it said, we don't have a consistent definition of autonomy. We don't have a consistent way of measuring it, identifying it. What are the metrics? So even within DoD, that's a problem. So as trying to address the topic of LAWS, I'm obsessed with the problem of this cross-cutting issue about AI, but so be it. So how did I get into this? I'm a philosopher and historian Moncay, mostly do bioethics. In 2006, I first published a book called Mind Wars about neuroscience and the military, and partly motivated to write this book because of exactly the point that Drew raised a few minutes ago, namely, what are the ethical obligations of the scientists, the engineers, and particularly in 2003, Nature published a very tough editorial that some of you may remember called The Silence of the Neuroengineers. And there was namely, you know what, you're taking money, but do you know who you're taking money from ultimately, and what are you doing with the money? What about the ethics? This stimulated a very tough response from the chief science officer at DARPA an issue or two later that said, look, we are making stuff that helps people. We are making stuff, for example, he didn't use this example, I will, for amputees. And this struck me because my mother was an amputee of the right arm at the clavicle when she was 40. So an arm that could be used by somebody who loses a limb in a war, in service, is also relevant, to civilians who lose their limbs because they have, and as in my mother's case, a cancer at an early age. So because I wrote this book and because I'm a quote unquote ethicist, I started getting invited to projects like this one at the National Research Council in the late 2000s. There's a number of these related to neurotechnology and ethics. This somewhat innocuous title actually conceals a whole lot of talk about national security issues. Not classified, you can go on the National Academy of Sciences website and download it for free. As a result of going to some of these meetings, I got to know Ron Arkin, a distinguished roboticist at Georgia Tech. And Ron had a grant from DOD in, I think it was 2006. And Ron's notion was this: given that human soldiers rape and pillage, maybe it would be possible to reliably write into the software of autonomous weapon systems the laws of armed conflict. And they would ethically perform better. And he started writing about this. And this is his book, Governing Lethal Behavior in Autonomous Robots. This very quickly got a whole bunch of pushback, nice academic, genteel pushback, but pushback nonetheless, in books by people like my friend Wendell Wallach, an engineer, Patrick Lynn, a philosopher. So this is kind of an ongoing debate, but really I think got started with Ron's proposal. But I do think it's important to identify, where the popular culture is on this, which is actually pretty close to the reality. When I was, how old was I? I'm not going to tell you, 12 years old, when I watched Dr. Strangelove and learned about the Doomsday device at the end of Dr. Strangelove. That was an automatic device. But Skynet in Terminator is an autonomous device in some sense. And so even the popular culture is following this notion that, neural net-based AI has displaced good old-fashioned AI, the kind of automatic, not even AI really, right? The kind of automatic system that would be triggered by an incursion into our airspace, or in this case, into Soviet airspace in Dr. Strangelove. Problem is that ultimately, if my robots are losing to your robots, I'm not going to stop there. I'm not going to say, well, no contest, my robots lost, yours won. My survival as a state therefore is over. I'm not going to fight anymore. That's not the way it's going to work, right? Ultimately, if I'm a state and I believe that my essential interests are threatened, it's not going to be simply a robotic war. And this is the problem. And if you don't believe me, you can read Ender's Game, that my colleague Mark Adams in History of Science told me to read a few years ago, which I said, it's a kid's book for 50 pages. He said, no, it isn't, keep reading. So look, some of the basic premises of lethal autonomous weapon systems, and I'm just going to assume the just war theory principles that other people will no doubt remark upon. We call them lethal, but you never know. They might be non-lethal weapons, can be lethal. And I just cite very briefly the Moscow theater crisis in 2002, where over 125 people died after fentanyl was pumped into the HVAC system. Autonomous weapons are emerging technologies. It's a whole other topic, a related topic. The Collingridge dilemma expressed in 1980 is essentially it's hard to regulate emerging technologies. You don't know where technologies are going. That's why we call them emerging. And then finally, just with respect to non-proliferation issues, the first mover has to set the rules. And I know, so for example, Susan Lindy, my friend and colleague who's part of this program, she can tell you all about nuclear weapons and the way that we did not set the rules before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we didn't set the rules with Stuxnet in Iran either. So it almost never happens, right? First mover advantage, and this isn't original with me, lots of people have pointed this out. First mover advantage really has to be accompanied by people setting the rules for use. Dual use has, I think, already come up a bit. There are a couple of dimensions to dual use, and really you have to define the term in one way or another when you're going to use it. And often it's not defined, I think, when people use the term. So it's either you've got the civilian military axis, you've got the benign malign axis, and a single technology can originate in one cell, or move to a couple of, or be in a couple of cells, or be in every cell, depending on the circumstances. So I think we need to be clear about which of these axes we're talking about when we talk about dual use. And in fact, as we well know, military and civilian is as a distinction is increasingly irrelevant. And again, an example of this is cybercrime, and again, not by any means original with me. Susan Lindy just mentioned her car and what could be built into her car. I'm going to defer to the engineers here, but I believe that if she has a pretty recent vintage automobile, that the onboard computer is constantly sending data to the company about the performance of her vehicle. Maybe Daniel or somebody else can tell me I'm wrong, but I believe that's the case. So all of your instruments are collecting, and collecting is a very neutral word. It's what Facebook says, right? Collecting. They're more than collecting. They're analyzing, they're assessing, they're using, they're applying to their interests. This is the part of the way the world is. You're not being hacked. You paid for the car, and you probably signed something that said, yeah, I can tell, when you're doing something in your car. So look, I'm a philosopher by training. I worry about the meanings of autonomy. Autonomy is a many splendored thing. In political philosophy, it means something like the self-governing state. In Kantian moral philosophy, it means that I am a moral agent who has the ability to self-legislate the moral law within. In robotics, it means the capacity of a system to make its own decisions or something like that. And whenever we use these kinds of metaphors, I think of a late philosopher, Nelson Goodman. Nelson Goodman was a professor of philosophy at Penn, then went to teach at Harvard. And he has this wonderful line. It is, a metaphor is an affair between a predicate with a past and an object that yields while protesting. We have to be very careful about being prisoners of our metaphors. Right? When we say a system is conscious, what are we really talking about? This continues to be grist for the mill of many philosophers, of course. So, I've been interested in how you classify weapon systems, the so-called in-the-loop systems. They're old. The Civil War, the Tesla motorboat, remote aircraft in World War II, B-17s that were remote controlled. During the Cold War, aerial vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles for images and heavy payloads. You can classify systems by relative autonomy. Dumb weapons, maybe something like the Doomsday Device, but the Doomsday Device is the most extreme version of this. Good old-fashioned AI-based weapons, like the PackBot, this thing that I would like to have on my lawn, just in case there was a nasty visitor showing up. But now I think starting in the 90s, particularly after the first Gulf War, computational AI-based weapons, and the discovery or rediscovery of machine learning after people didn't have confidence in it for a while and then came back to it. So all defense planners and engineers talk in these terms about on the loop control autonomy, how to increase it. But so these are just a couple of examples of what's come up since the Gulf War and being used in Afghanistan. There are many other systems or parts of the families of these systems. I think what we started to see in kind of 2012, I look for moments that you can see conversations change. So in 2012, a couple of interesting things happened. First, the Defense Science Board published this piece about the role of autonomy in DoD systems. And then somehow I managed to get Paul Gigot, who was continued as the editor of the Wall Street Journal, to accept this piece on robot soldiers. I sent it over the transom. Gigot said to me, actually, I'm going to take this piece. It was sort of in that tone of voice. And then the campaign to stop killer robots really gets off the ground. So you have a lot of things are coming together in 2012. And what I'm going to do is kind of follow this over the last 9 years and how this conversation has gone. So also in 2012, the Autonomy Priority Steering Council in DoD publishes this brief. And there, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides that I thought were really interesting at the time about some of the challenges of the modern battlefield that are being addressed by what's called autonomy, the attempts again to distinguish between automated technology and autonomous technology, expressed as a continuum. I think the problem is it's more than a continuum, right? It's a multidimensional distinction, the relationship between automation and autonomy. But what I think is really interesting here is that autonomy works best so far, autonomous systems of any level of autonomy work best in static environments. And so far as I know, there's no lethal autonomous weapons system that is deployed that works in the kind of dynamic environment that is usually the case as you look ahead to the modern battlefield as the conflict is unfolding. So, I'm glad I'm not responsible for this slide. I don't know, I've been looking at this for days and I'm still not really sure what it says, but this I think is really interesting. So this is back again in 2012, and already you have this notion that somehow AI and human cognitive models have to be integrated. And I think that as I've gone through this, I'll go through this in the next number of slides, there's more and more of a sense of the teaming or collaboration between the system and the operator. So 2014, Chuck Hagel, when he's talking about the third offset strategy, a term that I think is used somewhat less in DoD than it was a few years ago, he mentions systems autonomy. This gets a lot of attention. Again, the word autonomy is kind of emerging in the public, and people are fascinated by what could it mean. Already the Future of Life Institute notion of meaningful human control, this phrase in 2015, in response to worries about autonomy. I think it's a good term. It's a nice expression. But as these people know, as well as anybody else, the devil's in the details. So what counts as meaningful human control? I'm old enough to remember the Vincennes tragedy and the way that apparently the captain of that vessel did not have good information coming from the Aegis system that he could read quickly. And the result was that 290 people on this Iranian passenger jet were killed. Was that meaningful human control? There was, in terms of what I've been able to find in public about this episode, it looks as though the information was not delivered in a way that was easy for a commander to appreciate. But there are certainly people in engineering who would say that the Tomahawk has more meaningful human control than that missile system on the Versailles in the late 1980s. It is, and yet it is an autonomous weapon. So if meaningful human control is going to be the criterion we use, then the Tomahawk system and the descendants of the Tomahawk system, very much deployed now, would have to be withdrawn. I don't think that's very unlikely to happen. Again, just following some documents, this is the Defense Science Board's summer study on autonomy. And we can see I think the thinking getting more sophisticated and focusing more and more on human interaction with the systems, on the nature of human oversight, and pulling away, I think, from the early enthusiasm to anything looks like full autonomy. I'm just going to show you a couple of pieces that I pulled out, a couple of bites. This is really the issue here, that the tempo of the modern battlefield is so fast that it is a fantasy to think that any human brain is going to be able to integrate raw information. Already so much is coming through algorithms that are in onboard systems. So we already moved into a world in which lots of decisions are being made by algorithms, as we know, in onboard computers or in computers in a bunker somewhere. And the individual is trying to make sense of what is already highly digested information. So, again, I think in 2016, you see more definition of what people mean by autonomous systems, an attempt to dig a little deeper. I found this second remark really quite interesting. I don't know if this is a response to something that the DoD was seeing or the DSB was seeing already, but new AI-enabled operations by our potential enemies are sometimes politely called partners or competitors. I don't know what immediate action means, but this I thought was quite an interesting throwaway remark in that report. So again, pulling back, I think, in the last few years from the notions of full autonomy after an initial burst of enthusiasm, they're supervised systems, they're collaborative systems, and we don't really have to worry about those couple of slides that I showed you about levels of autonomy. Let's put that aside. Also around this time, I think quite interestingly, also in 2016, General Selva is really coming out publicly and saying we're not going to have weapon systems that are on their own deciding to kill human beings. Now, that's not what we mean by autonomy. Again, kind of shrinking back from some of the earlier assumptions that people might have made about autonomous systems. And again, from General Selva in 2017, we're taking our values to war, and whatever our values are, we're going to be proportional, we're going to be discriminate. It's not as though we are ignoring the modern application of just war theory, right? And then again, pulling back a bit on perhaps some of the remarks that were made in light of the threat off strategy language in early, a few years before this, you have Secretary Bob Work, who I was hoping to spend some time with at Perry before the pandemic. I still want to be able to sit down with Mr. Work, really admire what he's been able to do. He says, look, this is about human-machine collaborative networks. This is not about full autonomy. So, the only guidance that doesn't take very long to read about autonomy in weapon systems is 3000.09. I think it says, basically what needs to be said. This is not autonomous selection and engagement in targets by robots. That's not what we're talking about. I pulled this slide out of a handbook that I was given when I visited the Picatinny Arsenal in northern New Jersey and northwest New Jersey a few years ago. And I spoke to a couple of the engineers there about 3000.09. It is not an engineering guidance document, right? It's a policy document. It's a philosophical statement. But the engineers like to go on to say things like this. Well, future armament systems will require autonomous and remote operation capabilities. I think there's a bit of a gap here between what the policy says and the way that the engineers are still thinking. Probably one that needs to be addressed. I'm just going to show you a quick little anecdote. Consider this a bit of comic relief. I went to visit the Shrivenham Defense Academy system, Defense Academy in the United Kingdom, probably about 10 years ago. And this is an interesting place because this is maybe the only place where the rising officers, mid-career officers from both India and Pakistan actually spend months together. And those relationships that are forged at Shrivenham, this is the old empire, right? Getting back together again. Those relationships could save the world someday. So I'm giving a talk, a version of my talk about neurotechnology and ethics. And all those guys wanted to talk about, I'm not making this up, is Firefox and Clint Eastwood's plane. They really wanted to have a plane that they could have a kind of brain-computer interface with that plane. And I get that. I think that'd be a lot of fun. So supposedly the Pentagon is building something like Firefox. Well, not exactly. Robotic wingmen. They're really, as far as I know, these are basically drones that the pilot, him or herself, can operate. It's a little different. And I think there is, again, I think there's a certain amount of skepticism we have to have. Sometimes in the science world these days, we talk about a science by press release. And I think we have to be a little, we have to be a little skeptical about some of the things that are being released by being told by DoD these days. To their credit, and I will say this, to Secretary Esper's credit, going through DoD advisory boards, these ethical principles for AI were articulated a couple of years ago. I think this is a really great. And now the question is how the system actually integrates these principles into developments in defense planning and engineering. So I was happy, actually, for a couple of reasons, to get to know Daniel through email a little bit. And I went back to this report that he was part of, along with Vijay and others, a few years ago. And I was particularly interested in this element that they're talking about in terms of what needs to be done, the social interaction issues. And I was really happy because I'm able to advertise a project that I just started that I mentioned a little earlier with Minerva funding. There's a lot of talk about whether commanders will trust their new AI weapons and tools, right? The commander trust of AI, the commander trust of weapons systems that are in some sense autonomous. And I think this goes back to anxiety about that catastrophe with the Iranian passenger jet and the Vincennes. But what our project is interested in is teaming. Teaming at the ground level of the warfighter. We call them warfighters. I think the Brits still call them soldiers. The warfighter on the ground, as it were, which could happen through some kind of technology that DARPA has called N3. This is a long-standing project. And essentially, these are neurotechnologies that would hopefully not be physically implanted, but that would be wireless. The group that started at Brown University, that created a spin-off company called BrainGate. They've been doing work with people with tetraplegia and controlling their environment through wired implants. But they reported a very encouraging advance, which is a wireless implant with this patient subject who is controlling his environment through a computer with a wireless connection. So we're moving more and more rapidly into an area in which brain-computer interface is going to be, in some sense, wireless and not require the kind of surgery that would be required through, like Elon Musk's Neuralink, where you're actually, sewing into somebody's skull. I don't think that's going to play. So using BCI as an example, this is the kind of thing that I'm interested in with my colleagues. The secret of success when you're a senior faculty member is to have a really smart postdoc who writes you into grants. And this is happily what happened to me with this person, Nick Evans, now at UMass Lowell, and his colleague, Neil Shortland. This is an idea that I'd had with Mind Wars a number of years ago, and Nick wrote it up because I'm not a good grants person. And also doing this with Mike Gross, who is a political scientist at Haifa, who's an expert on military medical ethics. So let me just tell you a little bit about what we're interested in with this, in this project, which we've just started. So human experiments with soldiers is a complicated area. Experiments started, probably as soon as in the ancient world, anybody picked up a new sword, is this going to work? In the US, this has been a very vexed problem. So you had mustard gas experiments with sailors in the 1930s before World War II. Then you have all kinds of controversy in the 1990s about vaccination, including the anthrax vaccine, and whether that was responsible partly for what's known as Gulf War illness or Gulf War syndrome. That medical debate has still not been resolved. When you put on a uniform, you sign away a lot of your rights. And so how do you manage the accessibility of people in uniform to being in experiments? And there are ways, frankly, to kind of get around that problem, like the deployment of atomic veterans in the 1950s and early 1960s, when in the atomic test shots, when that was considered to be training, not an experiment, even though they had badges to check their lethal dose of radiation and so forth. So
It's my unpleasant duty to tell you that you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, great. I can do it in 2 minutes. Thank you, Daniel. So what are our aims? How do you do ethical experiments with warfighters with regard to testing neuroenhancements for restoring or maintaining human performance and capacity? Our system of reviewing human medical experiments is designed for therapies, not for enhancements. And FDA is struggling with this question. So, how do military commanders think about this? How do they weigh the risks and benefits of experimental technologies that are going to be used by their warfighters and experimenting this with their warfighters without repeating some of the problems of the past, right? So this is the significance of it. I think it's pretty clear that the military is different now from what it was in the 50s, and people are more aware of their sense of their own rights, and nobody wants to be a human guinea pig, least of all when you volunteered to be in the service. So we are in this project going to look at this issue of teaming with weapon systems and with human beings, and how will this work with the individuals who are actually using these devices. So we'll have an historical inquiry. We'll of course do the normative ethical stuff, and we're going to do a survey of commanders and planners and lots of people who have some thoughts about this. So that's our project. These are some of the previous products of my colleagues on the project. I look forward to coming back in 3 years and telling you if we've come up with anything. So thanks so much. I just have to leave you with a parting shot from my friend Missy Cummings at Duke. Some of you may know Professor Cummings. I've known her for a long time. And maybe this is basically kabuki theater. Maybe this is like Star Wars. Maybe we just have to convince the other guys that we have all powerful AI and we don't actually have to create it. Thanks so much.
Professor Moreno, thank you very much for your talk. Folks, it's now, we're encouraging on the lunch period, which is a terrible thing to do. So I think—
I'm looking forward to the lunch, Dan. What are we getting for lunch?
I think what we'll do is hold questions to the panel discussion at 4, okay? I hope that you will all be able to return. And we will resume this meeting at 1:30. We'll come back live at 1:28 and hope to see all of you here exactly then, at which point we'll have a next talk by Professor C.J. Taylor in the GRASP lab, and his work is fascinating. I urge you to listen. He's on the front lines of what we can do today. Thank you very much to all the speakers. I thought it was a tremendous morning, and I'm looking forward to much more conversation this afternoon, and hopefully moving ahead along the lines that Mark Yim mentioned. I'll elaborate on those just in advance of the panel. Thanks so much. We'll resume in about 90 minutes and 88 minutes.